I often comment that the book called The End of Leadership, which is my most recent book, is actually literally maybe going to be my last book ever on leadership. How can you write another book on leadership when it's called The End of Leadership? But it's also the case that it really has been the culmination of many books I've written on leadership, beginning decades ago when I started first becoming fascinated with leadership, and now, of course, followership. The book really does build on works that I've written, particularly in the recent past, perhaps more than anything else, Bad Leadership, which is the first book in which I realized that the way the world worked now was not just about leaders, but was equally about followers and context. And I since talk about the golden triangle, an equilateral triangle in which one side is indeed the leader, but the other two sides, there are two other sides, and one of those other sides is the follower or followers, and the other side is context. So The End of Leadership talks about it really has two themes. One is about leadership and change, in which the followers and context, both historically and contemporaneously, are much more important than they've ever been before, and similarly, the leader or leaders are less important than they've been before. And the second running theme, which relates to the first, is what I call the leadership industry, which is raising questions about the way we teach leadership, the measures or lack thereof in terms of how we assess our capacity to teach leadership. So my term leadership industry really does refer to those now countless courses, seminars, centers, institutes, of which the Center for Public Leadership is ironically or amusingly one, that are devoted to leadership. And since I'm at Harvard, I will simply close this comment by saying, if you look at the mission statements of most of Harvard's professional schools, they nearly all have the word leader or leadership in them. So what does that tell you about the contemporaneous leadership industry? Well, one of the reasons I talk about followers as much as I do about leaders is because I'm a small student of history. And if you look at the history of patterns of dominance and deference, you will see that times change. So Plato talked about the philosopher king, and Machiavelli talked about the prince. But then when we get, for example, to the Enlightenment, we suddenly have a conversation that is not only about leaders, but that is about followers, and that is about the sharing of power. Suddenly leaders are not, it's not about the divine right of kings anymore, or philosopher kings or princes, but about how to have power shared, a system of governance in which power is shared. Once you get to sharing power, you realize that not everybody's a leader. Some people are what I call followers, although we could debate the term. I won't go into that at this moment. But again, if you start with the Enlightenment and then you go through the 19th century and the 20th century, certainly the 20th century rights revolutions, civil rights, women's rights, gay, lesbian, and transgender rights, even animal rights, all those rights revolutions are really all about followers telling leaders, after all, we want to have our own voice. We refuse to be dictated to. We demand to have an equal say. So over time, democratization has made the system such, or made patterns of dominance and deference such, that increasingly leaders need to share their power and influence with their followers. And the 21st century, for reasons of culture and technology, have taken this to yet a further extreme, with technology now recently in particular, again, changing patterns of dominance and deference in ways we could not have anticipated even a decade ago. Subsequent to Bad Leadership, which was kind of divided into leaders, followers, and context, I decided that followers merited their own book. Now, I am not literally the only one to have written about followers, but I'm almost the only one. There are a billion books about leaders and leadership, and you can count on one hand, and I mean that quite literally, the numbers of books that have been written about followers. So I decided it was time, both intellectually, how do you talk about leadership without talking about followership, but also in terms of practical politics. The world is changing now increasingly from below and not from top down. So followers really should be a far bigger part of the conversation about leadership than they generally are. So when I wrote the book Followership, one of the things I felt a real need to do was to distinguish different kinds of players from each other. We're very painstaking in how we talk about and dissect leaders. We never bother to dissect followers. So I divided them into 5 different types, basically along levels of engagement. So at the one extreme, you have the isolate, that is the citizen or the worker in the workplace who is really detached from his or her surroundings, all the way to the other extreme, which is the diehard follower, who is willing to risk life and limb for the sake of his or her leader or cause or whatever is the issue at hand. I think leaders around the world are understanding that unless they are more connected to their followers, they will be endangered, whether literally or metaphorically. In this day and age, it does not work anymore to be dictatorial in their approach. We have flattened hierarchies, admittedly, sometimes in name only, not so much in reality. But by and large, leaders are being trained at every turn to connect more with the people that they're ostensibly leading. Needless to say, this depends also on context, so that the situation we have in China is very different from the situation that we have in the United States. But the most successful leaders anywhere in the world now have mastered, in different forms to be sure, but have mastered the sense that they need to pay attention to their constituents in new and different ways. I do not think those of us in the field of leadership studies or those of us in the field of leadership training and development have been particularly good at examining the work we do. We are, as I've suggested, really relatively bereft of metrics. Our metrics tend to be subjective rather than objective. And I often point with, I guess, maybe wry amusement, or maybe I should say depression, to the curious trajectory. So that on the one hand, you have the burgeoning, the hugely money-driven and successful leadership over the last 30, 40 years, which shows no signs, I might add, of stopping or slowing down. And at the same time, let's be honest, during the same 30, 40-year period, you have a deterioration in the reputation of leaders, an increasing lack of faith in our leadership. The Center for Public Leadership has the National Leadership Index, which testifies vividly to their decline, that is, leaders' decline in reputation. So there's something odd about this picture and something that merits, I think, a more honest conversation among those of us with an interest in leadership than we have had up to this point. I mean, I don't want to be labeled as somebody who calls the leadership industry a failure. I think there certainly have been some successes. I would never deny that. I think they've been fewer and far between than some of us originally hoped and intended. And I think the evidence for success is relatively scant. So one of the problems with the leadership industry, at least as I see it, is that we expect to get rather spectacular results in a very short period of time. So most of the leadership industry is based on short-term training or development of some kind. So we have a course, we have a weekend, we have a 3-month program of some kind. So it's at least possible, and this is something that, again, I think should be discussed, that leadership training and development and leadership studies needs to be a longer and more deliberate process, perhaps one that starts not just in a professional school or even at the undergraduate level, but in hasty fashion and targeted at the general public, that is, students generally, rather than at some more specific or select students. I guess, again, what I'm saying is I would do this if I were queen of the leadership world, which I'm definitely not. I would certainly put up for discussion a longer, more intellectually driven program that then ends up with leadership practice. But I would not necessarily assume that leadership, any more than swimming or piano playing or any other kind of skill, is something that can be taught quickly and easily. So, I guess if I had to summarize the end of leadership, I would say that, it has two themes about leadership and change and about the leadership industry. And again, if I were queen of the leadership world, I would connect the two. I would ask, what is it that we can do when we teach leadership either from an intellectual point of view or from a practical point of view that connects to the context within which we live, connects to the holistic approach, that is not only fixating and obsessing about leaders and becoming leaders, but asking also about everybody else, the other constituents, the followers, ordinary people. What kind of a more holistic and deliberate approach do we need to take in order to really develop the kinds of leaders that in the end are for the common good and not only for a more select or self kind of constituency? I often comment that the book called The End of Leadership, which is my most recent book, is actually literally maybe going to be my last book ever on leadership. How can you write another book on leadership when it's called The End of Leadership? But it's also the case that it really has been the culmination of many books I've written on leadership, beginning decades ago when I started first becoming fascinated with leadership, and now, of course, followership. The book really does build on works that I've written, particularly in the recent past, perhaps more than anything else, Bad Leadership, which is the first book in which I realized that the way the world worked now was not just about leaders, but was equally about followers and context. And I since talk about the golden triangle, an equilateral triangle in which one side is indeed the leader, but the other two sides, there are two other sides, and one of those other sides is the follower or follower.